Hi class, in this recording we're going to talk about general anatomy of our kidneys. As we look at the kidneys, they are going to be against the posterior of the abdominal pelvic wall, or the abdominal wall. So we have an anterior view, this arrow is pointing towards the front of the body, here we have posterior, here is a vertebra for a frame of reference, and then right here is a transverse slice through a kidney. So as we look at the kidneys, in terms of elevation in the body, they're going to be right at the bottom of the rib cage. The top half, the superior part of the kidney is going to be covered up by the floating ribs, and then the inferior part of the kidney is actually going to be exposed and not covered up by the rib cage. So they typically go from T2, the most inferior floating vertebrae, or rib I should say, all the way down to L3. And as we look at these, our right kidney is going to be slightly lower than the left kidney because we need to make room for the right lobe of the liver. And as we look at rib number 12 is going to go across the middle of the left kidney. So as we're looking at the left kidney versus right kidney, the right kidney is going to be more exposed or less covered by the rib cage than the left kidney is. And the key phrase we use to describe the cavity is the cavity the kidneys are located in is retroperitoneal. And when we say retroperitoneal, this is kind of an old school term that's slowly being phased out. The abdominal pelvic cavity is also known as the peritoneal cavity. Retro means behind. So usually when people are talking about something that's retro, they're referring to something that was popular several decades ago. Hey, that looks really retro, dude. In this context, we're not referring to go behind or backwards in time. We're referring to a physical location being behind or posterior to something. So to use more updated terminology, instead of saying retroperitoneal, we would say posterior to the abdominal pelvic cavity or abdominal cavity. And that's where we see this kidney located. We also are going to have the urinary gland, the urethra, and the urinary bladders, all part of this retroperitoneal structure. Now, if we look at the kidneys right here, we have a frontal slice of the kidney. The kidney is about the size of a bar of bath soap. For those of you who aren't familiar with how big a bar of bath soap is, another analogy is that your kidney is about the size of the palm of your hand. And as we look at the lateral surface, it's convex, it's going to stick outward. And then as we look at the medial surface, that medial surface is going to be concave. And then this concave portion is going to be referred to as the hilum. And this is a term that you see over and over again in human anatomy. And to review, because I've already defined it in several other recordings, a hilum is an indentation in an organ that has lots of tubes going in and out. So in this case, we have the renal nerve, renal artery vein, and the urethra, the ureter. What's wrong with me? The ureter going in and out. So we have lots of tubes, and I'm going to shift to red here. This red line represents the hilum, and it's an imaginary line that I've just drawn across there where all those tubes are going in and out. Now, as we look at our kidney, the surface of the kidney is going to have some coverings on it to help protect it. The most superficial of them is going to be the renal fascia. And that renal fascia is the super glue, so to speak. It binds the kidney to the abdominal, or to the posterior abdominal wall to help keep it from shifting around. The next deepest layer is the perirenal, I should say, perirenal. Peri meaning for around the perimeter, renal meaning for kidney, the perirenal fat pad or fat capsule. And our kidneys have tons of fat in them. And depending on who you talk to, discerning chefs will prefer cooking and deep frying with the kidney fat as opposed to any other fat in the body. They swear that the kidney fat is the best fat to deep fry stuff with. I'm thinking of my grandma Kathy. She makes the best deep fried donuts. And yeah, she always would go to the butcher and get the kidney fat from the pigs and cows that were being slaughtered. And then directly on the surface of the kidney, we have the fibrous capsule. This fibrous capsule is going to be on the immediate surface of the kidney. And if you ever are fortunate enough to do a kidney dissection, it's pretty easy to locate that fibrous capsule. It is going to be made of lots of collagen fibers that are going to wrap around the capsule and then extend outward towards that renal fascia. And it's going to allow for our kidneys to move around just a little bit. So when we go from lying down to standing up, our kidneys can drop about 3 centimeters, or about 1¼ inches when we go from lying down to sitting up, standing up. And that's because that fibrous capsule has a little bit of flexibility to it. As we look at the parenchyma, this is a generic term, and just to review, it's the glandular part of an organ. So when we look at the renal parenchyma, this is the part of the kidney that makes the secretions. So this is where we make the urine within our kidneys. And our renal parenchyma is going to be C-shaped when you have a coronal or frontal slice. And it's going to encircle the sinus. To find that sinus, look for this cavity space right here. This is our renal sinus. And then encircling the renal sinus, we are going to have the parenchyma. And I'm going to use blue for the parenchyma right here. So it's this entire outer area around the sinus that makes the urine. And as we look at that sinus, the renal sinus, it has lots of blood and lymphatic vessels, and what makes up a large proportion of it is urine collecting tubes. We also are going to have some empty space, and that's where we are going to just kind of pack it in and fill it all in with adipose tissue. So instead of using packing peanuts to keep these tubes separate from each other, we use fat to keep these structures in place. As we look at the parenchyma of the kidney, it's broken up into the cortex and the medulla, which again are fairly generic terms for organs. The renal cortex is around the outer perimeter. The renal medulla is deeper, more medial in the kidney. So I'm going to use bright green right now for the cortex. That green cortex is shown here. Whoop. And then the medulla is going to have these triangular structures within it. So here in blue is our medulla. And both the cortex and the medulla make up the parenchyma. And within the renal medulla, we have two structures that I'd like to highlight for you. So I'm going to clear the screen. I'll use bright red for the renal pyramids. These renal pyramids aren't actually triangles. In 3 dimensions, these are cones or conical in shape. But when we have this this coronal slice through the kidney, they appear to be triangular pyramids. So just bear in mind that we're looking at a 2-dimensional view of a 3-dimensional structure. And this is where we are going to have most of the actual urine generation within the medulla. At the very tip of the renal pyramids, we have the papilla, and those papilla are going to extend into the the urine collecting tubes. Another name for the papilla of the renal pyramids that you will occasionally see is the apex of the renal pyramid, because it's the pointy end. As we look at the renal columns, I'm shifting to blue now. Renal columns are in between the renal pyramids. So we have renal columns and renal pyramids alternating within the renal medulla. As we look at renal columns, the renal columns are primarily going to serve to ferry blood, carrying blood towards the cortex and carrying blood from the cortex. Whereas as we look at the renal pyramids are going to primarily function to send to send urine towards the renal sinus. Now, as we look at a lobe of the kidney, we typically will refer to one lobe of the kidney as one renal pyramid plus the cortex above it. So if you were to just make a bunch of triangular slices through the medulla and through the cortex with the pointy end of your triangle terminating at the renal papilla, that would give you a lobe of the kidney. And as we look at at the point of the lobe, right at that renal papilla, we're going to have a minor calyx. And this minor calyx, shown here in green, is going to collect urine from one lobe of the kidney. And then we can have multiple minor calyces merged together to form a major calyx. So if we have 2 or 3 minor calyces converging, we have that major calyx that I just scribbled over with bright red right here. And then where the major calyces converge, we have the renal pelvis located right here, which is going to directly translate to the ureter, the tube that carries urine away from a kidney. And a lot of times, especially in a lab situation, students will ask me, hey, how can I differentiate the end of the renal pelvis to the beginning of the ureter? And that's where the renal hilum comes in. If we go, I'm going to write it in green right now. If I draw an imaginary line right here that shows where the renal hilum is. So this is a line that is just kind of an imaginary line for that renal hilum. On one side we have the renal pelvis, and on the other side we have the ureter. As we look at blood circulation in our kidneys are a lot like our brain, in that our kidneys are not very big, but they get a disproportionately large amount of blood delivered to them. And for our kidneys, there's 2 reasons why they need a disproportionate amount of blood relative to their body mass. They are going to filter the blood, and to filter the blood has to be sent to them. And then finally, kidneys use up a lot of ATP. They need a lot of cellular energy. So when we look at our basal metabolic rate, our kidneys are about 1/5, 21% of our overall calories that we consume with our BMR, basal metabolic rate. Now, when we deliver blood into the kidneys and take blood away, thankfully, mercifully, the arteries and veins have identical names. So if it's going to the kidney, we call it an artery or an arteriole, and if it's going away, we call it a venule or a vein. So the hard part is just learning the initial names. So first we have, I'll go with bright green here. We have the renal artery, and that renal artery is going to carry the blood to the kidney, and then it'll divide into segmental arteries. Those segmental arteries will then further divide to interlobular arteries. And those interlobular arteries are going to be within a renal column, in between the renal pyramids. From the interlobular artery, the blood changes directions. And now it's going to be going over the arc of the renal pyramid. And as the blood changes directions to arc over the base of the renal pyramid, we now have the blood in the arcuate arteries. And then from the arcuate arteries, the blood will then change directions again. We have a 90-degree turn to make the blood vessels travel perpendicular, and they radiate outwards through the cortex. As they are radiating outwards into the cortex, we call them the cortical radiate arteries. And then from the cortical radiate arteries, we go to the little tiny capillary bed where all the action takes place. That little ball of capillaries is called the glomerulus. And after the glomerulus, after we filtered that blood into the glomerulus, and we'll have one glomerulus per nephron, we then will start going through veins. We'll have a cortical radiate vein, to the arcuate vein, to the interlobular vein, to the segmental vein, to the renal vein on our way out. I haven't talked about nephrons yet in this presentation or in this recording. A nephron is the name of the structure that filters the blood within our kidneys. And we can see in yellow here a nephron that I'm circling in green. And we'll talk about nephrons in a subsequent recording. So, to diagram it out for you, blood from the heart goes from the aorta to the renal artery, segmental artery, interlobular artery, arcuate artery, cortical radiate arteries. And then, I hadn't mentioned this one yet, we have the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole is going to carry blood directly from that cortical radiate artery to the glomerulus. And as we look at the glomerulus, that little capillary bed where we filter the blood within the kidneys, depending on the kind of nephron we're working with, there's a different pathway that we can take. As the blood immediately leaves the glomerulus, it's going to go through an efferent arteriole. So A for access, E for exit. And after that efferent arteriole, some of our nephrons will send blood to the peritubular capillaries. Other nephrons will send blood to a bed of capillaries known as the vasa recta. But regardless of which capillary bed the different nephrons will send their blood to, afterwards we go to the cortical radiate vein, which corresponds to the cortical radiate artery. Then we have the arcuate vein, the interlobular vein, and then we go back to the renal veins and the inferior vena cava, which ultimately will carry blood back to the heart. Now, as we look at these nephrons, I have diagrammed on our screen for us the two different kinds of nephrons. We have the nephron that is very small, that makes very dilute urine, known as the cortical nephron, that is mostly in the cortex. And then we have the nephron that's larger, that makes very concentrated urine. As we look at this nephron that is both in the cortex and in the medulla, we refer to this as a juxtamedullary nephron. And note, to divide, here we have the cortex on the top of our figure and the medulla on the bottom of our figure. To divide the cortex from the medulla, we have the arcuate arteries and veins that arc across that renal pyramid. So if we're looking for a line in the sand, arcuate arteries and arcuate veins divide the renal cortex from the renal medulla. Now, when we're working with the juxtamedullary nephron, they have a capillary bed that goes deep down into the medulla. And that capillary bed, I'm going to clear the screen here, this capillary bed that goes down into the medulla is referred to as the vasa recta. And as we look at the cortical nephrons, those cortical nephrons have a capillary bed up here in the cortex. And that capillary bed in the cortex is referred to as the peritubular capillaries. And it's worth noting that the vasa recta will drain primarily directly back into the arcuate vein, whereas the peritubular capillaries can go either to an arcuate vein or to the cortical radiate artery. That's all we have for this recording. We talked about general positioning of the kidneys and some big structures within the kidneys and blood flow within the kidneys. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.